This video is a recreation of an insurgent attack in the village of Wanat in Nuristan province on July 13, 2008. Located in northeastern Afghanistan, Nuristan province is just south of the highest peaks of the Hindu Kush mountains. The region is spectacularly rugged and divided into numerous small river valleys separated by steep mountain ridges. Task Force Rock, 2nd of the 503rd Infantry, deployed to Afghanistan in June of 2007, determined to build on its predecessor's success in the Pesh River Valley and its capillary valleys of Wadapur, Korangal, and Waigal. Task Force Rock, one of 4 maneuver battalions, was subordinate to Task Force Bayonet. Within Task Force Rock, Chosen Company was responsible for the Waigal Valley. At this time, the Afghanistan Theater of Operations was Central Command's lower priority, with most of its resources and efforts focused on Iraq. Within Afghanistan, Task Force Rock was not the main effort, and so was forced to operate without optimal manning. Without sufficient forces to employ the clear, hold, build strategy common to counterinsurgency operations, Task Force Rock adopted the separate, stabilize, engage model from Task Force Spartan. Task Force Spartan had demonstrated some success with this model throughout the area of operations, including the Waigal Valley, by coupling it with the practice of locating small bases containing platoon-sized forces near local populations. At the outset of Task Force Rock's deployment, they had 14 such bases, including 2 in the Waigal Valley. Successful employment of various assets greatly enhanced the success of these small bases. They relied heavily on aviation, engineering, and fire support to extend their reach, sustainability, and survivability. This was of particular importance in the Waigal Valley because Kop Ranch House, near the village of Aranas, and Kop Bella were only accessible by helicopter. In August 2007, Chosen Company commander publicly fired the incompetent and corrupt local Afghan security guard chief at the ranch house. Shortly after his firing, on August 22nd, more than 60 insurgents attacked Kop Ranch House in an attempt to overrun the post. The insurgents penetrated the Kop defenses by exploiting Afghan security guard weaknesses. When it was over, 1 Afghan security guard and 1 Afghan National Army soldier were killed in action. 11 paratroopers were wounded. This action highlighted Kop Ranch House's known vulnerabilities, isolation from the village of Aranas, and dependence on helicopter transport. As a result, Task Force Rock abandoned Kop Ranch House early in October. There were 2 other actions that provided further indication of the deteriorating counterinsurgency situation in the Waigal Valley. First, on November 9th, Chosen Company's 1st platoon was ambushed following a shura, or village council meeting, in Aranas, sustaining heavy casualties. Afterwards, the Task Force Rock commander informed the Aranas local civilian leadership that all reconstruction projects would be frozen until they agreed to assist coalition forces to improve security in the Waigal Valley. The second event took place on January 26, 2008 at Kop Bella. Sergeant First Class Kaler, the platoon sergeant of Chosen Company's 2nd Platoon, while checking Afghan security guard stations, was shot and killed by an Afghan security guard sentry. An official AR-15-6 investigation ruled it as an accident, but the platoon still felt that he had been murdered. In contradiction of Islamic and regional traditions, Chosen Company was not offered any regrets or condolences from the local population. The lack of customary grief practices further weakened relationships between coalition forces and the Waigal population. The local population was not merely expressing traditional xenophobia and desire for isolation, but was also responding to legitimate threats from active insurgents. They felt they could not be seen as supporting coalition forces unless they were being afforded adequate protection. Kop Bella had been identified as a vulnerable post as early as the Task Force Rock pre-deployment site survey. Its isolation from ground-based resupply and reinforcement caused concern that it could be overrun by a sizable insurgent force, or that a resupply helicopter could be shot down. Contributing to this unease were reports of insurgents massing forces nearby. On March 7th, Task Force Bayonet, the brigade combat team responsible for the Waigal Valley, ordered planning to commence for closing down Kop Bella and relocating the coalition presence to Wanat. Wanat was a desired relocation site because it was the Waigal district center, which would allow coalition forces to develop a good relationship with the local populace. It also had road access to Camp Blessing and the Task Force Rock headquarters 5 miles to the south. Coalition forces and local leadership began negotiations to secure a site for the new COP, which was to be named COP Kaler in honor of Sergeant First Class Kaler. Village leaders made it known that any cooperation on their part would leave them exposed to insurgent repercussions. At Ashur on May 26, local leaders asked that coalition forces seize the land and then make payments later to avoid displaying their overt cooperation with coalition forces. This sure did not go well, as indicated by a gross violation of well-established cultural traditions when the Task Force Rock leadership was not invited to have lunch with local elders. In addition, as the Task Force Rock element returned to Camp Blessing, they were ambushed, resulting in the serious injury of 2 paratroopers. The Task Force Rock officers felt the local elders had specifically delayed the Shura so that the ambush could be set up. The strained relationship was again evident during a similarly tense Shura on June 8th. Task Force Rock believed the only thing that prevented another ambush was the threat of spy planes and bombers. Despite local objections and only a few weeks of deployment remaining, Task Force Rock continued planning for the operation to close Camp Bella and relocate to Wanat. This operation was now coined Rock Move. From the company through the division level, it was believed that Task Force Rock was a better choice than Task Force Duke, their relief, to close Camp Bella and establish Camp Kaler. Chosen Company had spent 14 months conducting intense and complex counterinsurgency operations in and around the Waigal Valley. They were very familiar with the insurgents' tactics and weapon employment preferences and respected their fighting skill. Though Task Force Duke would be fresh, it would suffer from inexperience and reduced combat power compared to Task Force Rock. As Rock Move planning progressed into late June and early July 2008, Task Force Rock intelligence officers expected an attack on Camp Bella. This appeared to be realized on July 3rd, then again on July 4th when it came under mortar attack. Chosen Company directed 2 AH-64 Apache helicopters to engage a pair of hijacked pickup trucks egressing from the insurgent mortar positions. This attack effectively stopped future mortar attacks, but also killed and injured several civilians that were in the pickup trucks. According to U.S. intelligence sources, the insurgent commander was among the wounded. This event was viewed by local media as the last straw for good relations between coalition forces and local residents, but Task Force Rock's intelligence officer viewed it as having minimal impact. The operation planners, including Chosen Company leadership, considered several likely threats to Operation Rock Move. The first was the threat of an attack on Camp Bella or the shooting down of a transport helicopter during evacuation. The most likely threats were assessed to be harassing sniper and possible mortar fire at Camp Bella and Wanat, and possible ambushes and IED attacks on the road between Camp Blessing and Wanat. Rock Move was initially delayed several times due to a number of problems, including weather, logistics, and complications related to the July 4th mortar attack. Once it began on July 8th, it went as scheduled, with surprisingly no insurgent interference. 2nd Platoon of Chosen Company arrived in Wanat on the evening of July 8th, with the rest of the force arriving by helicopter on July 9th. The force at Camp Kaler was sizable, consisting of 3 paratrooper rifle squads, each with a vehicle and crew-served weapon, a platoon of 24 Afghan National Army infantry, and 3 Marine embedded training team members. For fire support, the platoon was augmented with a tube-launch wire-guided, optically tracked tow missile launcher system, a 60mm mortar, and a 120mm mortar. They were also augmented with a squad of engineers with a Bobcat loader to build fortifications and a long-range advanced scout surveillance system, LRAS-3, to provide around-the-clock surveillance. Task Force Rock had also secured the use of several different ISR platforms for use during Rock Move, including full-motion video as well as signals intelligence assets. Though powerful tools, these could not be counted on as the sole means of detecting enemy movement. Insurgents have become adept at using vegetation and moving in small numbers to avoid detection by ISR assets. Upon arrival, 2nd Platoon began to fortify their positions. They chose a large open field to the south of the town across the street from the bazaar and a building that served as a hotel and cafe. The COP was ringed with concertina wire, and the Bobcat was used to fill HESCO barriers and excavate positions for several squads in the mortar pit. First Squad set up a traffic control point near the bazaar, which served as the main gate for the COP. The Afghan National Army platoon established a second traffic control point 100 yards to the south, as well as fighting positions at the northern perimeter. 2nd Platoon also established OP topside on the ridge to the east of Cop Kaler. The OP was a complex of 3 interconnected fighting positions built around a large outcropping of boulders. It was not ideal terrain, having significant dead space, which could be used by insurgents to maneuver unobserved from a nearby ravine, and a civilian compound above it on the southeast ridge. Ultimately, those detractors were judged to be less severe than the risk of a more isolated observation post with better positioning. Topside was defended by the LRAS-3, 2 M240 machine gun teams, an M249 squad automatic weapon, and an M203 40mm grenade launcher. The force of 9 troopers was rounded out with several riflemen and the platoon's designated marksmen. It was ringed with a single row of barbed wire and walls of double sandbags. Each night, claymore mines were placed in the dead space to the north and east as additional security. Logistics difficulties caused many problems for 2nd Platoon. The heavy equipment and contractors that were supposed to build the COP had to be rescheduled due to delays in executing rock move. This also caused a shortage of construction materials, so none of the positions had overhead cover. The Bobcat was only partially affected because the fuel blivet pump broke and it took a day to get spare parts. This combination of events caused the paratroopers of 2nd Platoon to manually excavate their positions. The dirt was excessively hard and the weather hot, so they quickly ran through their 2-day supply of water. The lack of a planned resupply on the 9th forced them to ration their work and conserve water until a sizable water resupply came on July 11th. Rock Move enjoyed a significant amount of ISR coverage, especially in the early days of the move. The UAVs were directed to look in known insurgent safe havens and for movement on the hillside surrounding Wanat. No sizable insurgent presence was observed massing in the valley, so those assets were pulled to other areas. Throughout the initial days of construction, 2nd Platoon was constantly observed by insurgents. Several military-age males were seen sitting in the bazaar watching intently. Few women or children were observed in the area, and men were observed walking around slowly as though they were measuring the COP with pace counts. This scrutiny was reported to chosen leadership and identified as expected for the operation. Early in the afternoon of July 12th, another possible attack indicator emerged. The 2nd Platoon leader heard about a shura occurring in the town that he wasn't invited to. According to local custom, the platoon leader is equivalent to an elder and has the right to attend the shura. Upon arrival at the shura, he and the Afghan National Army representatives were not received warmly, and there was speculation that the elders were in fact planning an attack. This was reported up the intelligence chain of command and gained significant attention by Task Force Rock's senior leadership. Shortly after the shura, the chosen company commander arrived at the COP. Despite the outward resistance toward coalition forces, he was invited to dinner that night by a villager loyal to the Afghan government, who warned of an impending attack. The company commander was told he should shoot at anyone seen moving through the hills. Over the course of the deployment, the commander had received repeated warnings from locals about attacks that never happened, and put this warning in that same category. The unit's greatest fear was a rocket attack or indirect fire attack before they could install overhead protection. Nothing they experienced led them to believe a large-scale attack was imminent. On the morning of July 13th, 2nd Platoon Chosen Company and their Afghan partners conducted Stand 2 at 0400, and the 2nd Platoon leader was organizing a patrol to find a more advantageous site for OP topside. As Stand 2 continued, the trooper manning the Improved Target Acquisition System, ITAS, on the TOW observed 5 personnel moving through the hills 1,500 meters west of the COP. It was unlikely that local citizens would travel together like that, so Chosen Company began to coordinate a tow and mortar attack. 12 minutes after the insurgents were initially spotted, fire mission preparations were interrupted by 2 bursts from an insurgent machine gun and a large number of rocket-propelled grenades. The initial volley of machine gun fire served as a signal for the remainder of the insurgent force. Intense and continuous volleys of machine gun and RPG fire from all sides of the COP continued for the next hour. The insurgent fire was accurate and came from positions that were within several yards of the perimeter. The hotel, mosque, and bazaar were all being used as firing positions. Immediately after the enemy opened fire, Chosen Company commander notified Task Force Rock command post and requested indirect fire and air support. In response, Task Force Rock also ordered 1st Platoon at Camp Blessing to leave as soon as possible to reinforce 2nd Platoon at Wanat. The constant rate of fire from positions in the village effectively isolated OP topside from the main perimeter. Reinforcing and maintaining contact with the observation posts became Chosen's top priority for the remainder of the fight. The opening volley was particularly devastating to the TOW and the other crew served weapons at the COP. 3 RPGs caught the TOW vehicle in their crossfire, setting the vehicle on fire. This forced the crew to abandon the vehicle and move to the command post. The 120mm mortar section also drew tremendous fire during the opening portion of the attack. The mix of full and half-filled HESCO barriers provided some protection from insurgents who had climbed nearby trees and who were firing from the building roofs. The mortar section managed to execute the planned fire mission and then reverted back to defending the pit with grenades and small arms. Coalition forces made several attempts to reach the 60mm mortar position, but were deterred by the heavy rate of fire. Its location in the middle of the COP and incomplete fighting position made it especially dangerous. It would not be fired for the duration of the engagement. A few minutes into the attack, an RPG round exploded near the ammunition supply point within the mortar pit. This caused the personnel in the mortar pit to evacuate to the command post position. Shortly after, the TOW round started to cook off in the TOW vehicle, scattering burning missiles throughout the COP. Chosen Company commander was managing fire support assets and making reports to headquarters. Rock Move had priority of fires for Task Force Rock, who launched 155mm indirect fire, which landed only 6 minutes after the attack started. The mountainous terrain made accurate targeting with the 155mm difficult, causing them to impact inside the danger close radius of 660 meters from Cop Kaler. Responding to an early request for air support, a B-1 bomber dropped 2 bombs north of the battlefield to prevent insurgent reinforcement 38 minutes into the attack. The traffic control point manned by 1st Squad Chosen Company did not escape insurgent attention. They were taking intense fire from the compound to the southeast, disabling their M2 50 caliber machine gun only 5 minutes after the fight started. They returned fire with an AT-4, destroying the position, but fire from other positions continued. OP topside was devastated by the initial fire. Despite being badly wounded, the surviving paratroopers managed to return fire until they either ran out of ammunition or their weapons were damaged. After initially using one of 2 available M240 machine guns, they then continued firing with M4s, grenades, and claymore mines. It was not long before Chosen sent reinforcements to the remaining defenders at topside. 2 soldiers, including the 2nd platoon leader, ran between the bazaar and hotel. They reached the observation post safely, but were almost immediately killed along with the topside defender while attempting to set up a defensive position. By this time, 5 of the original 9 members of the OP garrison remained alive, but only 2 were able to engage several insurgents who had penetrated the perimeter wire and were only feet from the soldiers. 1 soldier was killed attempting to suppress enemy fire from the hotel. Running out of ammunition, 1 paratrooper found a light anti-tank weapon, which he fired before he and other survivors abandoned the OP and moved down to the 1st Squad's traffic control point. Unbeknownst to the paratroopers, they had left a soldier at OP topside. He managed to scrounge up an M203 grenade launcher and began to lob rounds into the dead space north of the observation post. After expending all his rounds, he contacted the command post on his forward observer radio and informed them that the OP was going to fall if reinforcements weren't sent. 1st Platoon departed Camp Blessing at 05:15 and was making good time en route to Wanat. Expecting IEDs and ambushes, the platoon used its heavy weapon systems to fire into known insurgent positions along the way. A 4-man element was dispatched to topside. They engaged insurgents as they moved to the observation post and quickly established fighting positions to counter a renewed insurgent attack. Shortly after, all 4 soldiers were wounded by a combination of RPG and machine gun fire. An inadvertent hot mic on the topside radio interrupted communications, causing the chosen leadership to lose situational awareness of the OP. This caused the platoon sergeant to quickly assemble and lead another relief element of 8 men to the OP. As they reached topside, approximately an hour into the fight, a pair of AH-64 Apaches arrived overhead to provide close combat aviation support. The Apache's first gun run was in the brush directly adjoining OP topside, and the second was about 50 yards east of the observation post, where the heaviest fire was coming from. Their arrival and subsequent fires had an immediate impact on topside by suppressing or destroying enemy forces. The enemy fire became less accurate and more remote, but they remained in their positions. UH-60 Casevac flights began to land at about the same time as the Apache's arrival. They utilized a primary landing zone at the main COP and a secondary impromptu LZ closer to OP topside. Casevac flights continued throughout the day through thick smoke and intense ground fire, evacuating 20 wounded and 9 KIA. 1st Platoon had traveled as quickly as possible from Camp Blessing, covering the distance in 45 minutes, half the time it normally would take, and arriving at 0600. They dropped 2 soldiers at the 1st Squad traffic control point and assigned their medic to the command post. The most desperate fighting at OP topside had ended by 0630, allowing 1st Platoon to mount a counter-assault. 1 squad from 1st Platoon with 2 vehicles advanced through the center of Wanat, catching the insurgents off guard. Taking advantage of the success from the vehicle assault, 1st Platoon dispatched an element to clear the hotel and eradicate any sporadic fire coming from the town. 1st Platoon continued to fight insurgents in and around the village, at one point engaging targets between the traffic control point and topside. The other squad from 1st Platoon went to topside, where they were greeted with heavy but distant fire from the hilltops. RPGs continued to come in from those positions, wounding 3 soldiers, but the OP was no longer under the threat of direct assault. The 1st Platoon's clearing operations pushed the insurgents out into the open where their positions were marked with colored smoke so the Apaches could engage. They fired both their cannons and Hellfire missiles into buildings in the town. As these effects took hold, they shifted fire to the compounds attacking OP topside. By 0830, 4 hours into the attack, the insurgents began to withdraw. Task Force Rock continued to send additional forces, dispatching a 2nd Quick Reaction Force from 3rd Platoon Alpha Company and a scout section. The Alpha Company commander took control of defending Cop Kaler. Later in the day, 3rd Platoon of Bravo Company arrived by CH-47 to defend OP topside. They were not at all satisfied with its location, and very quickly relocated the observation post compound to the south and east. Throughout the rest of the day, battalion and brigade leadership visited Wanat as additional assets continued to arrive. A section of Afghan National Army Commandos and U.S. Special Operations Advisors also arrived. During their search of the town, they found a large arsenal of over 100 weapons, including a large quantity of 7.62mm ammunition and RPGs at the National Police Station. This seemed excessive for the 20-man force, especially since many of the weapons had recently been fired. The police force, wearing unusually clean uniforms, acted as if nothing had happened. The Afghan commandos searched over 100 structures that day. They found numerous small arms, radios, IED components, and several handheld video cameras. In one house they found a stack of National Police ID cards and ID construction materials. This provided evidence that the town had been completely infiltrated by insurgents and used as a base for the attack. Small skirmishes between coalition and insurgent forces continued throughout the next day. Coalition forces used ISR assets to identify potential targets in the mountains around Cop Kaler, which were then engaged by a number of indirect fire and aviation assets. On July 14th, Task Force ROC Commander and his operations officer discussed two alternatives regarding the future of COP Kaler. Continue constructing the COP or withdraw. Several hours later, the decision was made to withdraw since the battle had drastically changed the conditions in Wanat. The locals clearly demonstrated their support for the insurgents and would not maintain the conditions necessary to support coalition projects. The incoming task force would not have the manpower to overcome this problem. In a country like Afghanistan with extreme terrain, altitude, and weather, the positive effect of a small infantry force can be multiplied by committing what would normally be considered an excessive number of force multipliers, such as aviation and engineer assets. In a war of small, heavily fortified posts, readily available aviation and engineer units can extend the reach, sustainability, and survivability of the maneuver formation committed to the fight. Soldiers at all levels can be lulled into a sense of security in regard to what they believe the enemy will do based on their previous experiences. Virtually everyone involved with Operation Rock Move, from squad to CJTF, expected the enemy to respond in a particular way. That perceived expectation was quite different from what actually happened. Military history has many examples of soldiers turning threat analysis based on templates into ironclad paradigms to their ultimate detriment. While the outcome at Wanat was not as catastrophic as some earlier examples from American military history, the cost to 2nd Platoon, Chosen Company, was high in July 2008. The normal progression of observations by low-level units up the intelligence chain can lead to the loss of nuance and significance of the successive intelligence summaries untimely reaching decision-makers. What the Brigade Combat Team S2 called atmospherics tended to drop out of the reporting of events as the multiple echelons recast and broadened their submissions. One general officer in the Wanat story considered this phenomenon important enough to warrant possible structural changes in the reporting methodology. When units rotate in and out of theater on a more or less fixed but staggered schedule, strong consideration should be given to the human effects such policies create. Tasks given to both incoming and outgoing units should be balanced against both units' capabilities and expectations. At the higher echelons, these considerations seem to have been well balanced in regard to executing Operation Rock Move. However, some of that understanding and balance may not have penetrated to the company and platoon level, where the policy had to be implemented at the end of a long, tiring, and dangerous tour in Afghanistan. In complex counterinsurgency environments, host nation forces will likely be present and will also not initially reach the level of professionalism thought to be necessary by their American counterparts. This disparity in capabilities can easily lead American personnel to underutilize host nation assets when attached to an American-led operation, resulting in a potential loss of fighting power. The Afghan National Army platoon at Wanat, while still relatively immature as a unit, seems to have been underutilized by 2nd Platoon in the days leading up to the engagement on July 13th. Given the need to be near the population in a counterinsurgency operation, coalition forces must retain situational awareness beyond their perimeter. If true standoff distance cannot be obtained or is deemed counterproductive, some means to see beyond the next building periodically must be gained. At Wanat, regular patrolling was foregone in the interest of advancing the state of defensive fortifications, a difficult but understandable choice. Given the particular physical layout of the Wanat position, more aggressive patrolling may have been the only means to gain necessary situational awareness to deny the enemy an unimpeded and concealed approach to the COP. In small unit actions involving defensive positions, choices made early in microenvironments may have large consequences. OP topside was positioned to see the distant bridges, higher mountains, and the southeast ridge, but had absolutely no capability to see into the ravine of the Waiscaldi Creek or into the dead space little more than 10 yards in front of it. The LRAS-3 emplaced at topside could see far but not near, thereby permitting a concealed approach to both topside, the village buildings, and the main COP. There seldom are perfect choices in defensive emplacement. The fact remains that an unobserved approach to within grenade range of the coalition positions was left uncovered. The formidable earth-moving done by the topside garrison may have inadvertently provided a false sense of security, however well it sheltered the occupants of the observation posts. Throughout the history of infantry fighting, emplacement decisions of only a few yards difference occasionally make a vast difference in the outcome of the fight. Wanat was no exception. Full-motion video and robust signal intelligence are helpful but are not cure-alls, even if available 24/7. Technology like ITAS and LRAS-3 extend the range of vision, but cannot see into dead space 10 yards to our front. Eventually, technology gives way to human factors, courage, fear, fatigue, to name a few. We must rely eventually upon what some have called aggressive self-rescue by individual soldiers. The engagement at Wanat is an example of that phenomenon.